They said nothing could grow here. Not after the war, not after the silence. But one man came back. Not for glory, not for money, but because of a letter. A letter from his grandfather that said only one thing: repair is healing. What he found wasn't just an old cabin. It was a miracle waiting to happen. A place where broken people learned to build again, where faith returned in the sound of hammers and laughter, and where love, quiet, humble, and real, lit up the cold mountains of Montana. If you believe that God still works through ordinary people, hit subscribe, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and thank you for being part of this journey. Because sometimes, the greatest repair happens not to houses, but to hearts. The wind cut through the pines like a whispering blade, scattering flurries of snow down the slopes of the Montana mountains. The sky hung low, a pale iron gray pressing against the valley, where an old dirt road wound toward a lonely cabin barely visible beneath a crust of frost. The air was thin, sharp, the kind that stung the lungs and reminded anyone breathing it that this land never gave anything for free. A single truck made its way up the road, tires crunching through ice and silence. Inside sat Ethan Cole, a man in his early 40s whose face carried the kind of weathering that doesn't come from age alone. His dark brown hair was cut short but uneven, a few strands of gray streaking above his temples. The stubble across his jawline was a few days old, and a faint scar ran along the edge of his chin, disappearing into his beard like a secret. His shoulders were broad, his build lean but solid, the way men look after years of carrying more than their share of weight. Ethan had been a soldier, one of those who went to war because it was easier than staying home. Afghanistan had left its marks on him. Not just the scar, but the quiet behind his eyes, the habit of scanning tree lines even when there was no threat, the way he always sat facing the door. Beside him on the passenger seat, Max, his 7-year-old German shepherd, sat upright with the disciplined patience of an old soldier's companion. The dog's coat was thick and dark sable, glinting between black and bronze when the light caught it. His muzzle had begun to gray, but his eyes, amber and sharp, still held the spark of focus. One of his ears bore a small notch, a reminder of shrapnel from a roadside blast that Ethan had never forgotten. Max was not just a dog, he was memory wrapped in muscle and loyalty. Whenever the silence in Ethan's mind grew too loud, Max's breathing grounded him. The truck's engine sputtered as Ethan reached the top of the ridge. Ahead, half buried in snow and shadow, stood the cabin, his grandfather's house. The logs were darkened with age, the roof sagging under the weight of years and weather. A crooked mailbox leaned by the gate, its red flag rusted stiff. The name still faintly etched on its side read, William Cole. Ethan sat for a moment with the engine idling, staring at the place that had once been his summer refuge. He could still recall running barefoot through the grass as a boy, his grandfather's voice calling him in for supper. That voice had been deep, calm, and always patient, even when life wasn't. Now the only sound was the wind scraping against the truck's frame. He turned off the ignition. The sudden silence filled the cab like water in a glass. Max tilted his head, sensing hesitation, then let out a quiet chuff. "Yeah, I know," Ethan muttered. "We're really doing this." He opened the door, boots sinking into the snow with a soft crunch. The cold bit his skin immediately, but there was comfort in that sharpness. It felt real. Max jumped down beside him, sniffing the ground, tail flicking once before standing still, alert. Together they made their way to the porch. The steps groaned under their weight, the railing rough beneath Ethan's glove. The wood smelled faintly of sap and iron nails. He brushed snow off the doorframe, revealing the same brass handle he'd touched countless times as a child. His gloved hand hesitated over it. The old man had been gone 3 weeks now. The lawyer's letter had been short and impersonal. You are the sole heir to Mr. William Cole's property. But tucked inside the envelope had been another letter, folded neatly, sealed in a smaller envelope marked in his grandfather's handwriting, for Ethan. He pulled the key from his pocket, the one mailed along with the papers, and turned it in the lock. The door resisted at first, then gave way with a sigh, the hinges crying softly. The smell hit him immediately: dust, pine, and faint tobacco, the scent of time preserved. The cabin's interior was exactly as he remembered. The stone fireplace at the far end, a threadbare rug before it. 2 armchairs positioned like silent witnesses. A shelf of old books sagged near the wall, their spines curled and faded. On the table by the window sat a lantern, its glass cloudy with soot, and next to it, a tin box. Ethan closed the door behind him. The world outside fell away, replaced by the muted quiet of a house long uninhabited. He set down his duffel bag and crouched to unlace his boots, the simple motion grounding him. Max padded ahead, nose low, tail still, exploring with the same slow caution he once used in ruined buildings overseas. Go on, Ethan said softly. See if it's still home. He shrugged off his coat and approached the fireplace. The old ash inside was gray, untouched for years. He found the box of matches where it always used to be, on the mantel beside a stack of yellowed newspapers. Soon a small flame flickered to life, spreading warmth and light that revealed more of the cabin's worn details. An oil painting of the mountains, a wooden clock that had stopped long ago, and a row of framed photographs. He lifted one. His grandfather stood beside a younger man in military fatigues, smiling under a sky of dust. It was a picture Ethan hadn't seen before. Guess you never stopped believing in the uniform, he murmured. Max lay down near the hearth, curling into a perfect circle. His fur shimmered gold in the firelight. Ethan ran a hand over his face and finally turned to the small envelope on the table. The paper was rough beneath his fingers, the ink slightly faded but unmistakably his grandfather's. He unfolded it slowly, his pulse quickening. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I've gone ahead. This old house isn't worth much to most folks, but to me it's everything. I built it with my hands, and I built it for our family. You've been running from the noise inside you for too long, boy. Maybe this place can quiet it. The walls here won't judge you, and the woods don't care what medals you have or don't. They just need care, same as you. There's work to be done, and you'll find what you need if you look. The tools, the books, the peace, it's all here. And if you can, help others too. That's the only way I ever found to make peace last. Your old man would have wanted that. So do I. Grandpa William Ethan's eyes lingered on the final line. His chest tightened. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice again, the same steady tone that once guided his hands when learning to carve wood, that same gentle reprimand when he'd lost his temper as a teenager. The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. He folded the letter carefully, sliding it into his jacket pocket as though it were something alive. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, but inside, the warmth grew steady. Ethan looked around the cabin once more, not as a ruin, but as a chance. His gaze moved to the shelf of tools, the old workbench near the window, the faded photograph of his grandfather's hands gripping a hammer. He felt something he hadn't in a long time, a pull forward instead of back. He crouched beside Max, scratching behind his ear. The dog opened one amber eye and gave a slow wag of his tail. "What do you think, partner?" Ethan said quietly. "Rebuild or run?" Max's ear twitched in response, a low rumble rising from his chest that almost sounded like approval. Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah, me too." He rose and looked through the window. The last light of day was fading, the snow outside catching the glow of the fire from within. In that reflection, for the first time in years, Ethan saw something more than a tired soldier. He saw a man still standing. He took a slow breath and whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe it's time to start again." The wind outside softened, and the old house creaked as if in reply. The snow returned to Pine Ridge with a quiet vengeance. By dawn, the wind had grown teeth, clawing at the eaves of the cabin, shaking loose flakes of ice from the roof. Ethan Cole woke to the sound of it howling through the chimney, the kind of winter song that reminded him of nights overseas when sandstorms buried whole camps beneath red dust. But this was different. This was silence fighting to be heard. He stirred the ashes in the fireplace, coaxing a flame back to life, then poured a small scoop of kibble into Max's bowl. The old shepherd stretched, yawning with a low rumble, his breath puffing white in the cold air before settling near the fire again. Ethan had been in the cabin for a week now. The first 2 days he spent just trying to make the place livable, patching leaks, fixing the chimney, clearing out furniture that had given up long ago. Beneath the dust, he found bits of his grandfather's life tucked everywhere, an oil-stained cap on a hook, a cracked coffee mug that still smelled faintly of tobacco, and 3 shelves of manuals about machines, engines, and repairs. The words, "Sua chua la chua land," "Repairing is healing," were written in his grandfather's steady hand on the inside cover of one. It felt like the man was still teaching him, just in another language. That morning, while the storm thickened, Ethan decided to explore the small basement he had avoided since his arrival. The wooden hatch was half hidden under a threadbare rug. It took some effort to pry open. The hinges resisted, then gave with a tired sigh. A cold breath of air rolled up from below, carrying the scent of oil, metal, and something else. Old wood and time. Max sniffed at the edge but didn't descend until Ethan clicked on his flashlight and started down. The basement wasn't large, but it was meticulous. Wooden shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars of nails, screws, and bolts sorted by size. A workbench stood in the corner, its surface scarred by years of hammer strikes. There were blueprints pinned above it, some of mechanical parts, others of simple wooden structures like fences or sheds. A heavy red toolbox sat beneath, its paint chipped, its handle polished smooth from use. When Ethan lifted the lid, he found tools wrapped in oiled cloth, each one sharpened and clean. At the bottom lay an old leather notebook bound with a strap. Inside, written in neat cursive, were pages of his grandfather's notes. Repairs done for neighbors, sketches of heating systems, and entries dated more than 20 years back. The final page stopped him cold. Sua chua la chua lan. If you fix what's broken around you, maybe you fix something inside you too. Ethan sat there for a long moment, the words burning deeper than he expected. Maybe the old man had known how lost he'd become. He closed the notebook gently, slid it into his jacket, and turned off the light. The basement door creaked shut, and, outside, the storm had begun to scream. By afternoon, The wind was a solid wall of white. Snow swirled like smoke past the windows, blurring the trees into shifting ghosts. Max paced restlessly by the door, ears twitching. Ethan tossed another log into the fire and listened to the storm beat against the walls. Then came the sound. A faint, irregular tapping carried by the wind. Not branches, not ice. Something else. Max barked once, sharp and focused, then twice more. Ethan froze, listening. There it was again. A distant cry, swallowed by the blizzard. "Stay," Ethan said instinctively, grabbing his coat and flashlight. Max ignored him, already pressing at the door. Together they stepped into the storm. The cold hit like a wall. Snow stung his face, the wind stealing his breath as he pushed forward through the drifts. Max moved ahead, a dark blur against the white, nose low, tail straight. "Find it, boy!" Ethan shouted over the gale. The dog barked once and veered left toward the line of pines where the sound had come from. The light from Ethan's torch flickered against the swirling chaos until he saw it. A car half buried in snow, its headlights still dimly glowing. Inside was a woman, hunched over the steering wheel, her window frosted over from the inside. Ethan yanked the door open. The woman startled, her face pale and eyes wide. She looked to be in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled into a loose braid and strands frozen against her cheeks. Her skin was fair, her lips cracked from cold, and her hands trembled as she tried to speak. I lost the road," she managed. Her voice was soft, but roughened by the cold, the kind of tone that once carried confidence but had been worn down by exhaustion. Ethan slipped off his gloves and checked her pulse. "You're freezing," he said. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly. "I think so." "Good. Come on. My cabin's half a mile." He helped her out, keeping an arm steady around her shoulders. Her height reached his chin, and though she was shivering, there was a certain steadiness in her movements, as if she wasn't used to being saved. Max circled them, pressing close, guiding through the snow. When they finally reached the cabin, Ethan kicked the door open and ushered her inside. The warmth from the fire spread instantly. The woman collapsed into the nearest chair, hands shaking as she held them toward the flames. Ethan grabbed a blanket from the couch and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, voice barely audible. Ethan nodded. "You're lucky my dog's stubborn." She smiled faintly, her eyes softening as she looked at Max lying by the hearth. "What's his name?" "Max, 7 years old, smarter than most people I know." Her smile widened. "He's beautiful." Now that she was out of the storm, Ethan got a better look at her. She had a kind face, strong jawline, high, cheekbones, and eyes the color of dark honey. Her clothes were practical, a thick brown coat dusted with snow, wool gloves, and boots that had clearly seen too many winters. She looked like someone used to work, not leisure. "I'm Ethan," he said finally, handing her a steaming mug of coffee. "Grace Miller," she replied, her fingers warming against the cup. "I teach at the elementary school down in Timber Hollow." Her voice carried a trace of warmth now, though fatigue still clung to it. "I stayed too late grading papers and thought I could beat the storm." Ethan leaned against the table, studying her. Not the best night for detours. Grace laughed softly, the sound fragile but genuine. "You can say that again. I've never been so grateful for barking." Outside, the storm raged louder, but inside the cabin the firelight flickered gently across the wooden walls. They talked quietly for a while, about the weather, about Pine Ridge, about how winters up here seemed to last longer than anywhere else. Grace spoke with a calm certainty, the tone of someone who'd learned patience through necessity. She told him the school's heater had broken weeks ago, and the maintenance man had moved south. "Most of the old houses here are falling apart," she said, staring into the fire. "Pipes freezing, roofs leaking. The town can't afford much repair." Ethan said nothing at first. He watched Max, asleep now, tail twitching in dreams, and thought about the tools in the basement, the notebooks, and the words his grandfather had written. Help others, too. The storm lasted through the night, the wind screaming against the shutters. But inside the cabin, it was calm. Grace fell asleep near the fire, her face peaceful in the flickering light. Ethan covered her with another blanket and stood watching for a moment, feeling something shift inside him, something small but certain. Maybe his grandfather had known this would happen, that a broken house would bring broken people together. He looked toward the basement door, then back at Grace and Max. "Maybe fixing things starts right here," he whispered. Outside, the storm began to ease, snow falling slower, softer, as though listening. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet so pure it almost felt sacred. The world outside the cabin was white and new, every branch draped in snow, every breath forming clouds that vanished into the pale morning. Ethan Cole stepped onto the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the powder. Max padded beside him, his sable coat dusted with frost, amber eyes sharp and alert. The air was cold but clean, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he could breathe without weight on his chest. Inside, Grace Miller was packing her things, preparing to head back to Timber Hollow now that the roads had cleared. Her cheeks carried a faint color from the firelight, and when she smiled, it reached her hazel eyes. "You've saved a schoolteacher and her dignity," she said softly, tightening her scarf. "I owe you coffee at least." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Just don't drive through another blizzard." Grace laughed, then reached down to pat Max, who wagged his tail gently. "Take care of this one," she said, glancing at Ethan before stepping into the snow. Her truck rumbled to life, and soon only the tracks of her tires remained, fading under the falling flakes. Ethan stood for a while, watching the horizon glow pale gold beneath the winter sun. The lodge felt quieter without her presence, but not empty. Something about the past few days had shifted him. Grace's words about the town's broken homes lingered like the echo of his grandfather's letter. He turned back toward the cabin, his mind restless. Maybe fixing the house wasn't just about survival, it was about purpose. By afternoon, he was back in the basement, sorting through the notebooks and tools he'd found earlier. Max lay near the stairs, chin on his paws, eyes following every move. While rearranging a stack of old blueprints, Ethan noticed a section of wall where the wood grain didn't quite match. He brushed away the dust, revealing a narrow outline, like the frame of a hidden door. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. He ran his fingers along the edges until he found a latch, rusted but still functional. The small door creaked open, revealing a shallow storage space behind the wall. Inside, beneath a canvas tarp, was a wooden chest. Its lid bore the initials WC burned neatly into the surface. Ethan lifted it carefully and set it on the workbench. Inside the chest were folders, rolled parchments, and a bound sketchbook thicker than the rest. He untied the leather strap and opened it. Diagrams, handwritten notes, and outlines of what looked like a workshop or training hall filled the pages. The title scrawled across the first page read, "The Healing Workshop." Ethan flipped through drawings of benches, machine parts, and teaching stations labeled mechanic practice, woodcraft, and basic carpentry lessons. His grandfather's neat handwriting filled the margins. For returning soldiers, for those who lost purpose. At the bottom of one page was a line that hit Ethan like a memory. Every man can rebuild something. Sometimes it starts with himself. He didn't realize someone was behind him until a voice spoke. "So he told you too, huh?" Ethan turned sharply. A man stood at the foot of the stairs, tall and broad, his coat dusted with snow. His beard was gray but thick, his face lined deep from years of work outdoors. His eyes were pale blue, steady but tired, and his hands, bare and scarred, looked like they had spent a lifetime shaping wood and steel. "Name's Frank Dawson," he said, stepping closer. "Used to live down the ridge. Worked with your granddad when this place was built." Ethan relaxed slightly, still wary but curious. "Didn't hear your truck." Frank gave a low chuckle. "Walked. Roads are half frozen, and I needed the exercise." His voice carried the roughness of age but also warmth, the kind that came from someone who'd seen too much but learned to live with it. "Your grandpa was a hell of a man, stubborn, patient, and just crazy enough to think he could fix the whole damn world with a wrench and kindness." Ethan gestured to the open sketchbook. "Looks like he tried." Frank's gaze softened when he saw the drawings. "That's his dream, right there. The healing workshop. He wanted to turn this old cabin into a place where veterans and townsfolk could learn to work again. Give him something to build when the war left him empty. He talked about it for years, but got sick before he could finish." Ethan studied the old man for a moment. Frank's hands trembled slightly when he touched the edge of the blueprints, and Ethan noticed a faint limp in his left leg. A faded tattoo of an eagle spread across his forearm, distorted by time and scars. "You served too?" Ethan asked quietly. Frank nodded once. "Vietnam. Left more than friends out there. Guess that's why your grandpa and I got along. We both knew what silence costs." His words hung in the air, heavy but honest. Ethan looked back at the plans. "He left a letter for me. Said this place had everything I needed to start again. Maybe this is what he meant." "Maybe," Frank said, then smiled faintly. "But this place needs more than ideas. It needs hands. And coffee. Lots of coffee." They spent the rest of the day clearing the basement, brushing years of dust from the shelves and sorting through the equipment. Frank moved slower than Ethan, but with precision, each motion deliberate. He talked as he worked, stories about William Cole teaching him how to build a roof with nothing but instinct and rope. "He used to say wood talks if you listen close," Frank said, wiping his brow. "I thought it was nonsense till I learned he was right." That evening, Grace returned, her truck headlights cutting through the falling dusk. She stepped out holding 2 thermoses and a grocery bag. "I figured you could use company," she said, smiling when she saw Frank. "And maybe dinner that isn't canned beans." She wore her usual brown coat, her auburn hair tied up under a knitted hat. Her presence immediately softened the cold space. "Grace Miller," Ethan said, introducing them. "This is Frank Dawson, my grandfather's old partner." Frank tipped his cap slightly. "Pleasure, ma'am. Heard you teach kids how to read. Brave work these days." Grace laughed. "And you build houses in a snowstorm? I'd say that's braver." The 3 of them shared a meal by the fire. Nothing fancy, just soup, bread, and warmth. Max lay between them, his tail thumping lazily whenever someone dropped a crumb. Frank unfolded one of the blueprints on the table. "We can make this real," he said quietly. "Your granddad had half the materials stored down in the old mill. I still know where." Grace leaned closer, her eyes bright with interest. "If this workshop helps people here find work again, I could help. The school could send students. Some of their parents used to be craftsmen." Ethan looked between them, the old soldier and the teacher, and felt the strange weight in his chest lift. "Then let's do it," he said. "Let's finish what he started." Max gave a short bark, as if approving. Outside, the snow had stopped, the night sky glittering with stars. Inside the cabin, 3 souls sat by the fire, and for the first time since his grandfather's death, Ethan felt the warmth of purpose flicker alive again. By early spring, the world around Pine Ridge had changed. The snow had retreated into the shadows of the woods, leaving behind wet soil and the faint scent of pine sap in the morning air. The lodge, once a decaying cabin haunted by silence, now hummed with life. Smoke rose from its chimney every day, not from solitude, but from the heat of work. Inside, the rhythmic thud of hammers, the hum of drills, and the low murmur of voices filled the air. Ethan Cole stood at the workbench, sleeves rolled to his elbows, teaching a teenager how to repair a rusted oil lamp. His hands moved with quiet precision, his voice low but sure. The boy beside him was Tommy Jenkins, 16 years old, with sandy hair always falling into his eyes and freckles scattered across a sunburnt nose. Tommy was shy, polite, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. His father had been a mechanic before a back injury forced him out of work, and his mother had taken cleaning jobs at the local diner. When he first arrived, Tommy was nervous, hands trembling whenever he handled tools. But Ethan saw something familiar in the boy's caution. The fear of doing wrong, the weight of having seen disappointment too young. "Slow," Ethan said gently. "Let the tool do the work." Tommy nodded, his lips pressed tight in concentration. When the lamp finally flickered to life, the boy's grin came bright and genuine, lighting his freckled face. In the back of the workshop, Frank Dawson stood over a group of men, his gruff voice filling the space. "Measure twice, cut once. That's not advice, that's survival." His large frame was bent over a table, guiding a younger veteran's hand along a plank of oak. Frank, now without his heavy coat, looked like a man carved from the same material he worked with. Broad-shouldered, weathered, sturdy. The lines around his eyes deepened when he smiled, and though his voice still carried the gravel of old battles, there was warmth behind it. He had found his rhythm again here, among sawdust and laughter. Near the window, Grace Miller sat at a long table surrounded by children and 2 single mothers from Timber Hollow. She wore a soft gray sweater, and her auburn hair fell loose around her shoulders. Her voice was calm, melodic, as she helped the children write their names in careful cursive. The lodge's learning corner, as she called it, had become a place for more than reading. It was where people remembered they still mattered. Grace had a quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to command attention to be felt. She carried herself with patience, though Ethan sometimes caught a flicker of sadness in her expression when she thought no one was looking, the kind that came from giving too much without expecting anything back. Even Max, the loyal German shepherd, seemed to understand his role in this growing community. He patrolled the porch each morning, greeted newcomers with cautious interest, and often lay near the children as they played, his watchful eyes soft with age. His sable coat was beginning to show streaks of silver along his muzzle, but his presence was steady, a living symbol of loyalty and calm. When arguments flared, as they sometimes did, Max would simply walk between people and somehow the tension would break, replaced by quiet laughter. As days turned into weeks, the healing workshop became more than a project. It became a lifeline. Word spread through Timber Hollow and the neighboring valleys, a place run by a quiet veteran, a school teacher, and an old carpenter where anyone could learn to mend, to build, to breathe again. The work gave people a reason to wake early and leave the past behind. Ethan hadn't realized until then how much healing could be built from the sound of tools and laughter. Then, one gray afternoon, the mail truck came rattling up the road, its engine coughing in the cold air. The driver, an older man with a thick mustache and a cheerful wave, handed Ethan a brown envelope. "Official looking," he said. Ethan turned it over. The return address was from the U.S. Army Training Command. His pulse tightened. Inside, a crisp letter awaited. Sergeant Ethan Cole, your record and field performance qualify you for the position of combat training instructor at Fort Lewis. Your leadership and experience are recognized as assets of high value. The position offers full benefits, housing, and reinstatement of rank. Report upon acceptance." The words blurred for a moment as he read them again. A steady paycheck, structure, purpose, the kind of life that had once defined him. The Army was offering not just a job, but a familiar identity. For a long while, Ethan sat on the porch, the letter trembling slightly between his fingers. The wind rustled through the pines, and from inside came the faint sound of laughter. Grace's voice, Frank's booming bark of instruction, and Tommy's quiet chuckle. Max came to his side, resting his head on Ethan's knee, amber eyes searching his face. That evening, as the light faded, Ethan placed the letter on the table by the fire. The room glowed with the warmth of the hearth. Grace sat across from him, grading the children's writing exercises, her brow furrowed in concentration. Frank had gone home for the night, and the lodge was calm except for the crackling of wood. When Grace looked up and saw the letter, she read the unease in his expression before he spoke. "They want me back," he said quietly. She set her papers down, her eyes soft but steady. "The Army," he nodded. "Training recruits, full position. Decent pay, benefits. It's what I used to be good at." Grace watched the flames dance for a long time before answering. "You're still good at teaching, Ethan, just not the same kind of lessons." He gave a small, humorless smile. "Maybe. But out there, I knew who I was. Here, I'm just patching roofs and fixing lamps." She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, not every battle needs a uniform. Not every soldier has to go back to the front to prove he's still strong. Some people come home to heal others, and that's harder." Her words struck something deep. The firelight caught her face, turning her eyes to molten amber, her expression open, sincere. Ethan looked down at Max lying quietly at his feet. The dog's chest rose and fell with slow, even breaths, as if he too understood the choice his master faced. For a moment, the wind outside roared, pressing against the windows. The fire flickered, and Ethan thought of his grandfather's handwriting. "If you can, help others too." When the silence returned, he exhaled, long and slow. "Maybe staying is its own kind of fight," he murmured. Grace smiled, her lips curving gently, relief and understanding mingling in her eyes. "Then fight for this," she said. "For them. For yourself." Ethan reached down, scratching behind Max's ear, feeling the old dog's warmth against his hand. "We've already got our battlefield, don't we, boy?" Max's tail thumped once against the floor, a quiet affirmation. The flames rose higher, crackling softly, and outside, the wind shifted direction. Not fierce now, but carrying the scent of thawing pine and distant rain. In that fragile calm, Ethan finally knew he wasn't meant to go back. His war had already ended. What waited now was life, and he was ready to build it. The year had turned full circle, and Pine Ridge was breathing again. The snow no longer buried the valley, but kissed it lightly, melting into streams that whispered down through the trees. The air smelled of pine, wood smoke, and sawdust, a scent that had come to mean life, not solitude. Where once stood an aging, forgotten cabin, now stood a living sanctuary, Cole's Lodge for veterans and families. Its hand-carved sign hung proudly above the entrance, crafted by Frank Dawson himself from an old beam of oak. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of purpose. Ethan Cole stood in front of the lodge, hands resting in his jacket pockets, watching the morning unfold. The sun filtered through tall pines, scattering light across the clearing. His hair was a little grayer now, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper. But they were no longer the lines of burden. They were proof of peace earned slowly, one day at a time. The lodge was alive behind him. Laughter, hammering, the shuffle of boots, the bark of Max echoing like an old friend announcing morning roll call. Inside, Grace Miller moved between tables with a clipboard in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. She had grown into her role as the lodge's heart, as much as Ethan had grown into its hands. Her auburn hair was tied into a braid today, and a streak of sunlight turned it almost gold. She wore a navy cardigan over a cream blouse, practical jeans, and the softest smile anyone could wear after long months of hard work. The children adored her. The veterans respected her. She had that rare balance of warmth and command, guiding without ever needing to raise her voice. At the far end of the hall, Frank Dawson worked beside a younger man, teaching him how to fit a hinge into a newly made door. Frank's shoulders had rounded slightly with the passing year, but his movements were still strong, deliberate. His beard, now nearly white, was trimmed short, and the faint limp in his left leg barely slowed him. There was contentment in his gruffness now, a quiet satisfaction that came from seeing the wood come alive under his students' hands. The man learning beside him was Cal Peterson, a veteran in his early 40s with close-cropped blonde hair and the restless posture of someone still learning to be still. Cal had once been a combat medic. The faint burn scars on his wrists told of an explosion overseas. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the softness of someone who had seen too much pain and now craved peace. Meanwhile, outside near the garden plot, Rachel Jenkins, Tommy's mother, was tending to the rows of vegetables that now thrived in the thawed soil. She was a woman in her late 30s, with short auburn hair tied under a bandana and the lean, steady hands of a nurse. Her laughter carried easily across the yard, light but knowing. Rachel had found her own kind of therapy here, nurturing life after years of caring for the wounded. Tommy himself had grown taller, his shoulders broader, his confidence unrecognizable from the shy boy of a year ago. He worked beside two other teens, painting the porch railing white, humming under his breath. Every so often, he glanced at Ethan, still in quiet awe of the man who'd taught him how to build more than just furniture, how to rebuild himself. And then there was Max, now 8 years old, moving slower but still full of alert grace. His once dark coat was silvering around the muzzle, but his eyes were bright and warm. He had become the spirit of the lodge, padding between workstations, lying near children during lessons, or standing guard by the door as if the lodge's soul depended on him. The veterans joked that he was the real manager, and perhaps they were right. That morning, Grace stood by the window as snowflakes drifted lazily beyond the glass. "It's hard to believe it's been a year," she said softly when Ethan joined her. "Sometimes it feels like this place built itself." Ethan chuckled, crossing his arms. "It kind of did. We just gave it a reason." Grace looked around at the scene. Frank teaching, Rachel tending the garden, Cal repairing a chair by the window, children scribbling in their notebooks. "Do you ever think your grandfather knew all this would happen?" Ethan's gaze drifted toward the fireplace, where his grandfather's old photo hung framed above the mantel. In it, William Cole stood tall beside the unfinished cabin, a hammer in one hand and a quiet smile beneath his mustache. "I think he did," Ethan said at last. "He just needed someone stubborn enough to listen." Grace smiled and reached out, brushing a bit of sawdust from his sleeve. "Well, you've done more than listen." Before Ethan could answer, the front door opened, letting in a gust of cold air and a young woman bundled in a navy coat. She carried a notebook and wore a press badge clipped to her scarf. Her name was Lena Ward, a journalist from the Bozeman Chronicle, early 30s, bright-eyed with a streak of curiosity that made people both wary and charmed. Her chestnut hair was cut short around her chin, and her expression mixed professionalism with genuine warmth. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, stamping snow from her boots. "I'm looking for Sergeant Ethan Cole. The folks in Timber Hollow said I'd find him here." Ethan stepped forward, shaking her hand. "Just Ethan these days. What can I do for you?" Lena smiled. "I'm writing an article on community recovery programs for veterans. They told me this place is different." Grace chuckled softly. Difference, one word for it. Lena spent the day talking to everyone, interviewing Frank about craftsmanship, Grace about education, Cal about healing through service, and even Rachel about rebuilding families. When she finally asked Ethan what the lodge meant to him, he hesitated, looking toward Max asleep by the fire. "It's not really about me," he said slowly. "It's about second chances. My grandfather left me a house, but he really gave me a reason to stay. The house had all I needed. I just didn't know that meant people." By the time Lena left, the sun was setting, bathing the lodge in amber light. The smell of soup drifted from the kitchen, and laughter rippled across the hall. Grace handed Ethan a mug of coffee, her fingers brushing his briefly. "You know," she said softly, "I think he'd be proud of you." Ethan looked out the window. Snow was melting from the branches, dripping like silver beads. "He already gave me everything I needed," he said, "and somehow, more than that." He glanced down at Max, who stirred, thumping his tail once before resting again. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of distant bells from Timber Hollow, a soft reminder that the world beyond their little haven still existed. But here, in this place built from loss and love, there was peace. As the fire burned low, Ethan stepped onto the porch. The mountains stood tall under a pale sky, and the last light of day broke through the trees like a quiet benediction. He smiled to himself, voice barely above a whisper. "You were right, Grandpa. The house had everything I needed, and more." The wind answered with a sigh, gentle and kind, carrying warmth instead of cold. As the light fades over Pine Ridge, we're reminded that sometimes the miracles we ask for don't come as thunder or lightning. They come quietly, through people. A helping hand, a shared meal, a home rebuilt not with wealth, but with love. Ethan inherited a cabin, but what he truly received was a calling to heal, to give, to believe again. And maybe that's how God works, not through grand signs, but through small mercies that grow when we choose kindness over comfort. If you're watching this, perhaps the same miracle is waiting in your life, not somewhere far away, but right where you are. In every act of compassion, in every person you lift up, you let a bit of heaven shine through the ordinary. May the Lord bless you and guide your steps, just as He guided Ethan, Grace, and everyone at Cole's Lodge. And if this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that faith still lives in small places. Leave a comment. Tell us what miracle you're praying for. And subscribe so you can walk with us through the next story of hope and grace. May God bless every hand that builds, every heart that forgives, and every soul that dares to begin again.